What I'm going to read is a paper that sort of, it's a paper that was written a couple years ago, but I have not proceeded much since that time. I worked through some of these questions, so it has something of a synthetic quality with relation to issues that I've been taking up with respect to rhythm. Well, let me just move into it. I think that I'm coming much closer to what we've been flirting with Bergson and with this third way. But anyway, I look forward to talking about that more. Let me go into it. This is such rich and challenging material. Sometimes one has to ground oneself in one's own language, and so I'll try to do that now. So this is a paper entitled Rhythmic Transport. I apologize if anybody has heard this. I have presented it, parts of it in a seminar situation. I don't think I've done so publicly, though I did discover that one of our students had put up a poster with the title of this paper and a picture of a racing car next to it. And this student claimed to be the co-curator of the event in which the paper was presented. I don't remember him there, and frankly, I wasn't talking about racing cars. But I am talking about cars, and I do intend to talk about racing cars someday. I want to try to analyze Ayrton Senna's experience in Monte Carlo on the basis of a notion of rhythm. But this is to come. Now I'm going to start out with a rather modest Volkswagen story. So, okay, the title of this paper is Rhythmic Transport, and I will move from a question into some of the work that I have done with Heidegger on some ways to approach what I offer here, or what I take up here in terms of, I would say, phenomenological experience of time. So, the title then is Rhythmic Transport. While I'm entering a congested traffic circle, more a knot than a circle, a rhythm from a fast-paced jazz tune on the radio enters my awareness. Those of you who know Brooklyn will know the Grand Army Plaza, and you realize I'm talking about a place where there are 6 lanes of traffic coming together and trying to negotiate their relations before speeding off into 2 or 3 different avenues. And so it's a rather complex situation. But I'm in this circle. It's a nice afternoon, and I start hearing something on the radio. The tune is all percussion and saxophone, as I remember, and it is punctuated with a repeated phrase enunciated by a husky female voice. I just want you to get together. I just want you to get together. Some of you will recognize that this is Saint-Germain. Now, the traffic picks up its pace, and I'm seized with the sense that now I can anticipate the movements of the cars. I know where they're going. Or better, I enter a kind of dance with them, transported by a strange clarity and sureness of movement. I move through the treacherous intersection with extraordinary ease and a delighted sense that I've caught the rhythms of the intertwining, competing flows of traffic in this circle. My awareness of this rhythm recedes soon after I've broken into the clear, and continue down the avenue. I'm not accustomed to reading from my computer. You'll have to forgive me if I have a few disrupted moments here. What is this heightened state that I've entered? Where is my dexterity, my grace coming from? One could say, accurately enough it seems, that no, it wasn't like that. It wasn't like that. One could say that I have found a rhythm. But this is where the questions begin. What rhythm have I found? Has the jazz piece merely tuned my responsiveness? Has it sharpened my senses and reaction times so that I move at a speed now that gives me the illusion of clairvoyance in my circumstances? And this experience, I think, is familiar to anyone who participates in sports. You start to feel that you're in the time of the events in a very curious way. Or has my attuned sensibility actually disclosed something of these circumstances, a rhythmicity of a kind? Has the rhythm of the jazz tune helped me to find the rhythm of the traffic circle? I have to say that I'm confident I have not imposed a rhythm, or something like a finer order on a loosely ordered play of movements. I know from hard experience the dangers implied in such presumption. It's not a matter of imposing rhythm. Moreover, I don't need such presumption because I have a sense that my circumstances have opened to me as I move through them, that I move with them. So, have I perhaps found a rhythmic articulation? Have I somehow drawn out an articulation that is fully of the situation? And if so, what kind of engagement could this be? How could I so successfully discover and practice the rhythms of such a complex situation? Perhaps we may take it as something of a given that traffic flows, be they in transport, communications, or exchange, will draw definable rhythms from the temporal regulations of diurnal activity and from the determinations of the lived environment, including population densities and technological infrastructure. Mathematicians can provide extremely precise descriptions of these rhythms, and ethnographers, with the help of analysts in fields such as human geography, can align these with the relevant local and global determinations, taking into account even such local factors as social organization and religious practice. My experience was on a Friday afternoon shortly before Shabbat. I was near Crown Heights, so this is important in the larger picture. There is surely nothing very daring in claiming that social experience has an important rhythmic dimension. But how do we understand what is happening when these rhythmic configurations disclose themselves in individual experience as such in a form of shared usage and thereby lend to a form of play? What rhythmic capacity has been set into motion? The attunement I experienced in my driving experience points not only to a fundamental disposition to rhythm, and the fact that we need to account for the fact of an opening to rhythm on the part of a subject, but it points even to a certain freedom in that disposition. Moreover, the possibility of this play opened in and through a juxtaposition of rhythms, where one that was pronounced helped to reveal one normally hidden or latent. The former rhythmic form, belonging to the distinctly musical idiom, that's the pronounced one I'm describing, and that I was capable of picking up, not only transported a linguistic content with an appeal to community, but communicated itself as a rhythmic form, idiomatically, in the manner of a kind of language. The latter, the one I referred to, involving the driving configuration, the latter rhythmic form, which I've called latent and I would describe as even unwritten, is nonetheless governed by an extensive set of sign systems and rules for comportment that could hardly be called natural, any more than those other flows of traffic to which I've pointed, information, money, and so forth. But its latent rhythmic articulation could only surface when it was punctuated by the jazz piece. I'll leave to the musicologists among us the task of accounting for the manner in which for an account of the peculiar way in which jazz plays at its own createdness, and might therefore help us understand its disclosive potential. And I'll simply underscore at this point that a form of art drew forth this rhythmic play for me. Forgive me, as I say, I'm not used to reading from the computer. I'm a little bit broken, out of rhythm. The conjunction of rhythms I experienced, in any case, appears to require some form of shared ground. Thus, one could not stimulate a free practice of the other without some fundamental articulation, if only between the music and a physical form of receptivity, a capacity for attunement that was translatable into something resembling a dance. Already with this formulation, we would say that one rhythm revealed another via a stirred rhythmic capacity of a fundamental kind. But it is also not a big step to suggest from here that one rhythm effectively communicated with another, that the peculiar schematism affected was simply a translation of rhythms, a particularly dexterous rhythmic transport. Perhaps we need only acknowledge the disclosive, communicative power of an experienced rhythm as set into play in a form of art, to recognize that a form of fundamental analysis moving to the grounds of language and lived experience itself, is required for a true Rhythmanalyse. To the extent that rhythm belongs to the very modality of our worldly experience, recourse to phenomenology becomes essential. But the need to account for this also prompts me to turn back to Wittgenstein and then Heidegger, on whom I want to focus here, in order to suggest that what we seek to understand in a case such as the one I have described are structures of shared usage, where usage is understood as the ground from which both forms of life, in Wittgenstein, and the worlds that define their unity, in Heidegger's sense, take their order. An order that for each of the authors is an order of meaning. I'm appealing to a core term that I try to work through with Heidegger, which is his notion of usage, der Brauch. And I'm playing with Wittgenstein, of course, because Wittgenstein understands meaning from the basis of use and usage. But Heidegger has an entire thought of usage which leads into his later thinking, which ultimately displaces the subject. But it's a rather interesting displacement. So I want to assert that customs and mores, or anything that might be defined as a habitus, are all to be understood from this ground of usage as forms of meaningful, sedimented practice, and whose meaning can be obscured precisely by the sedimentation or repetition. But this is not to say that all sociocultural practices may thus be reduced to language as forms of Sprachgebrauch. So it's not all language games. Indeed, the question of usage, as will become increasingly clear, offers the means to grasp extra-linguistic dimensions of the shared practice under consideration, and perhaps even the possibility of thinking a relation to rhythms that are not properly human at all. Given its full import in a Heideggerian perspective, it gives us the means to rethink cause and agency in art and ultimately social practice in general. So I will turn in what follows to what Heidegger offers of an approach to rhythm at what I have termed the existential level. The question of rhythm does not appear, at least initially at the existential level, the question of rhythm does not appear overtly in Heidegger's work until sometime after the so-called turn, but it is powerfully latent throughout those texts of the 1920s that treat of the fundamental constitution of the human Dasein. For it is from the opening of temporality in the Dasein that Heidegger hopes to derive the final grounding for an understanding of being at this point in his research. This is fundamental ontology. The sway of time's temporalizing, Zeitigung he calls it, introduces a rhythmic element into every dimension of the Dasein's lived experience. So I will begin from the existential analytic, following this recognition, and then follow Heidegger into the turn that unfolds with his thinking on art. That Heidegger understands time as the horizon for the understanding of being is widely known. But the import of this statement is not easily summarized for the reason that time is subject to so powerful a reconception in Heidegger, with consequent impact, obviously, on what he calls the meaning of being, and hence the possibility of our struggle with this term ontology. What exactly is being referred to here? A way is offered, however, by a striking locution that Heidegger adopts in speaking of the human relation to time. And here I am really talking about the 1920s and the existential analytic. Referring to the manner in which the human Dasein orients itself in all worldly dealings, and even toward the world itself, as it defines that for the sake of which it applies itself in those dealings. Heidegger says that the Dasein, I quote, uses its time. The locution is curious because it is so mundane, leading us easily to think of time as something extant at hand, something of which the Dasein simply disposes. But when we grasp that Heidegger is describing the manner in which the Dasein uses itself in the act of defining the finality of its existence, and in binding itself to this definition of its possible being, we glimpse the force with which the word use is employed. And we see how deeply the reference to functionality reaches in Heidegger's thought of the Dasein's productive activity, something that can actually be obscured by the way functional and instrumental relations are brought immediately to the fore when Heidegger lays out from our most proximate experience the pragmatic organization of signification. Again, I'm trying to pull his sort of pragmatics in terms of our everyday work in the world into the understanding of the Dasein's actual production of itself. It's a more fundamental pragmatics in that sense. Because again, Heidegger's pragmatism seems to lead to a very instrumental understanding of our being in the world, in the work of many commentators. But we must move to the more fundamental level to understand how a context of functional involvement is always already defined in the Dasein's existence, already significant. For the human Dasein has already projected an order of signifiability when it undertakes any end-directed activity. It knows its way about in its world for the fact that it has always already given this world to itself to understand, and has thereby opened a temporality. It has interpreted this world and holds itself in this world from the ground of its determination of its for the sake of which is, once again, the Dasein's own projection of its being able. But the very possibility of such a projective movement in which the human Dasein traces out for itself its order of ends arises from the opening of time, which is in fact the primordial tracing of this being's there, its da. We say of the existence of the human Dasein in its temporally defined essence, es gibt, to distinguish it from any intraworldly being, of which we say simply, it is. The Dasein certainly is in the world, thrown into factical existence, but it is also the there of this world's opening, which is primordially temporal in character. The es in that locution, es gibt, we could say, is time, at least in this point of the analysis. And it is from here that we have to understand Heidegger's meaning when he says that Dasein uses its time, or explains that the in order to of the signifying relations that the human Dasein projects for itself is time. In other words, that the Dasein is for its time. Because time is something the human Dasein has only inasmuch as it is drawn from what of time has been given. Time is the ground of possibility itself, a kind of source or wellspring whose generative character prompts Heidegger to refer back to Plato's idea of the good. When the Dasein uses its time authentically, Heidegger tells us it is more in being, richer than when it defines itself in relation to the entanglements of everyday expectations. Though he would allow us to think, I think, that a free use of time is possible, even in a traffic circle. Now, how the human Dasein uses its time is a matter of insistent concern for it. The Dasein, Heidegger says, is thus constantly expressing itself as it takes the time available to it. Taking time for itself, Heidegger says, it utters itself in such a way that it is always saying time. Time is constantly there in such a way that in all our planning and precaution, in all our comportments and all the measures we take, we move in a silent discourse. The latter discourse is a self-exposition of comportments, he says, that articulate the constant transposition of the Dasein, a being underway that originates fundamentally in a being moved, an ecstasis that determines each of the temporal directions of the Dasein's existence. Jean-Michel was talking about this. Thus, three ecstatic movements, expecting, retaining, and presenting, as he calls it, make time available, and their originary movedness as ecstatic openings form what Heidegger terms original time or temporality. I'll return shortly to the formal constitution of this unity, but I want to emphasize first two traits of the Dasein's interpretive use of time within its lived context of pragmatic relations. In this usage, time is significant, he tells us, first of all, and he tells us that it is public. So time is meaningful and it is public. Signifiability, Heidegger tells us, refers to the manner in which time is always appropriate or inappropriate, a right or a wrong time in relation to our concerns, all of which take their orientation from the in order to relations that structure the signifiability of the Dasein's world, Bedeutsamkeit. Time is always time for, or time to, within a context of pragmatic relations. Now the light is green, I say, and I have so much time to make at least 4 lane changes before I reach another light and then move on toward my destination, hopefully within the time I have allotted for my travel. I can expect certain things from the traffic around me and from the performance of my vehicle, in this case a Volkswagen. All of this is temporally organized, all of it is signifying. We thus see that the Dasein's temporal determinations are fully commensurate with the significance it assigns to the set of relations that define its pragmatic involvements, and therefore the things that find their place therein. Time, in this perspective, is world time. Heidegger further affirms that time has a public character when it is expressed in our being with one another. It is fundamentally shared, whether or not the now or the then are spoken out loud. We may date each now differently in relation to individual concerns, and we may experience the span in different modalities, but we all understand the expressed now, he says. I quote, "The accessibility of the now for everyone, without prejudice to the diverse datings, characterizes time as public. The now is accessible to everyone, and thus belongs to no one. On account of this character of time, a peculiar objectivity is assigned to it. The now belongs neither to me nor to anyone else, but is somehow there. There is time. Time is given, it is extant, without our being able to say how and where it is." End quote. That's from the English translation of the Basic Problems of Phenomenology. In the now, then, time is apparently given in its quasi-transcendental character. But what would be the basis for the shared usage of time? How can Heidegger assign this peculiar objectivity and general communicability to this temporal designation if it points to the facticity of time and is not simply a general operator? We broach here a forbidding question regarding the nature of Mitsein, being with. If time is always shared in our being with one another, then this more original relation that Heidegger terms Mitsein must entail some form of time with that is prior, in a logical sense, to its articulation in practical involvements. How could this be conceived? Actually, I'm moving back a little bit. I move from the interworldly relations in which time is time for this or that in an order of signifiability, to the opening of time wherein the Dasein could be with other Dasein in the ontological sense. So I'm moving from Miteinandersein, being with one another in worldly involvements, to a being with the other in time that is more primordial than those involvements. Here, to begin to approach this, we have to return to the theme of the originary unity of the three ecstasies, taking our guide from a subsequent remark on time's public accessibility. Again, I'm working in the same text from 1928. I quote, "The factor of the publicness of time is also rooted in the ecstatic horizontal character of temporality. Because temporality is intrinsically the outside itself, it is as much already intrinsically disclosed and open for itself along the directions of the three ecstasies. Therefore, each uttered, each expressed now is immediately known as such to everyone. In the Dasein's being with one another, in their communal being in the world, there is already present the unity of temporality itself as open for itself." Originary time, he tells us, I'm picking up again, commenting, originary time is essentially outside itself in its temporalizing. He quotes, I quote, "It is this outside itself, he says. This means, and as he goes on to comment, this means that each ecstasis, future, past, present, involves a carrying away toward something in a formal sense." And he continues on this motif. Each such remotion, Entrückung, getting carried away or pulled away, torn away, he says, is intrinsically open. A peculiar openness, which is given with the outside itself, belongs to the ecstasis. That toward which each ecstasis is intrinsically open in a specific way, we call the horizon of the ecstasis. The horizon is the open expanse toward which remotion as such is outside itself. The carrying off, or this remotion, opens up this horizon and keeps it open. As ecstatic unity of future, past, and present, temporality has a horizon determined by the ecstasis. So the movement Heidegger terms Entrückung, remotion, being torn away. This is the basis of the ecstasis, the transcendence of the Dasein in the opening of world. This movement takes its definition, including a certain hold or tenue. It's holding the human Dasein in this space, time space. The movement takes its definition from its horizon, and each ecstasis is so defined. Moreover, these ecstasies have their own ecstatic unity, and thus their own horizon, which leads Heidegger to say that temporality, I quote, is characterized by a horizon given with the ecstasis itself. So, future, present, past, each have an ecstatic horizon, but these ecstatic horizons are themselves unified by what he calls another ecstasis. And he says these are characterized in the transcendence of this remotion or this ecstasis. I emphasize this reference to characterizing because I think it is surely through this formal delineation, by defining traits, and here we have the form of a defining sketch, and the openness that this secures, that time gains its shared and communicable character. The temporal ground of being with, and perhaps we could say the originary with of this relation, is traced in what Heidegger calls at this point the horizon. Heidegger will then name what are traced in the Dasein's multifold temporal Entrückung, schemata. So each ecstasis, he will tell us, is characterized by a schema. And the unity of the ecstasis has its own schema. I'm repeating again this idea of an ecstatic definition of a horizon. He calls this a schematic. Right? We're pretty close to Kant here and the notion of schematism as he understands it in his Kant book. So I repeat, each ecstasis is characterized by a schema, and the unity of the ecstasis has its own schema. Time is thus configured in schemata that mutually modify one another, and time can't be thought except in this relational structure, with the ecstatic movements that traverse and delineate the very Da of the Dasein as time reaches and recedes in its temporalization. Obviously, the configuration of these traces and the schemata themselves must have a very supple or fluid character. And I suspect that this is why the term schema proves so important. So there is a Bewegung, there's a movement, and we're close to Bergson, I think, in this constitution of the horizon of temporality, which would be the ground of anything like being with and the opening of possibility of a worldly relation. But let us first try to appreciate the full scope of this evocation of the dynamic character of the Dasein's temporal foundations. I've based most of the preceding discussion on Heidegger's exposition in the Basic Problems of Phenomenology of 27 and I think 28, with an eye to being and being in time, of course, Sein und Zeit. In the lecture series of 1928, The Metaphysical Foundations of Logic, Heidegger takes forward the analyses of his previous academic year by describing the ecstatic opening of temporality in still more vivid terms, offering the transport of remotion, Entrückung, as a raptus, and its impetus as an Überschwung, he tells us. I'll translate in a moment. The reach and recession of temporalization, back and forth, future, past, present. The reach and recession of temporalization delineated in temporal schemata, here named extemata, constitutes, he tells us, a swing, an oscillation, a vibration, or as we saw a moment ago with Überschwung, a sway. And Heidegger emphasizes again that the Dasein would have no capacity to project upon its future and no relation to the thrown being it has been, in other words, no relation to future, no relation to past, were it not for the primordial impetus, the Schwung, the sway of the opening of time. Temporality, I quote, is the free oscillation, Schwingung, of the whole of primordial temporality. Time reaches, schwingt, reaches out, and contracts itself, verschwingt, sich selbst. And only because of momentum, Heidegger insists, Schwung, only because of momentum, Schwung, is there throw, facticity, thrownness. And only because of oscillation is there projection. So we think these originary grounds of the Dasein's existence, facticity and then its projective, futural tendencies, these proceed from temporality and are made possible by temporality, even as they are temporal relations. Schwung, Heidegger, Schwung, if we just look at this term a little bit, I'm going quickly, connotes impetus or swing. Schwingung suggests a swinging, a reverberation, a resonance, an oscillation, or a pulsation. Erschwingung is employed when we say that something is attainable or in reach. Verschwingung would connote contraction. Only by this primordial movement, Heidegger insists, can there be the thrownness that is known most originally in attunement, or the projecting movement of understanding. Any disclosing act in the Dasein's being in the world takes its possibility from this originary movement. And I'm sure you will have heard by now Ella Fitzgerald in the background of my words. It don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. Now, it's perhaps even reductive to define this movement as rhythmic, because there are resonance and oscillation here, and so rhythm might be too narrow a phrase, or it has to be opened. But I hold to the notion because of Heidegger's appeal to the term schema, or schema, to name the delineation of the horizon of each form of transport in the temporalization of time. Heidegger will use other terms to denote these tracings of the out there, and I believe his notion of the Aufriss is proceeding from this ultimately. But schema is particularly telling and suggestive because it points forcefully to Kant and his interpretation of Kant's schematism, even while referring back to the Greek term schema, which I've been smuggling in already, which is a term, as Heidegger knew from Aristotle at least, that is almost synonymous with rhythmos. And of course, Benveniste's article on schema and rhythmos is the invaluable text for this topic. But schema in Greek is virtually synonymous with rhythmos. It's striking that Heidegger is actually so circumspect with the term rhythm in this period. When he does appeal to it a bit later, he does something rather intriguing. On the one hand, he appeals to the Greek understanding of rhythmos as that which distinguishes bodies in their form or their configuration, emphasizing always that rhythm is something that articulates. So rhythmos is a matter of how we differentiate forms. Rhythm, so Heidegger insists, is an articulation, and rhythm articulates. In emphasizing this differentiating and articulating character of rhythm, he demonstrates that he is cognizant of a traditional but also spurious etymological derivation of rhythmos from rheo, which prompted an interpretation of rhythmos as deriving originally from the movements of the seas. In an essay on Georg, he writes, I quote, "Rhythm, rhythmos, means not flow or stream, but rather articulation." Rhythm then orders and composes. The other word he uses throughout this period is fügt, and I was thinking a notion of Fügung. Rhythm orders and composes as it configures movement. It brings it to a moving but composed configuration. At the same time, however, Heidegger will retain an insistent reference to a flowing or fluid movement throughout his oeuvre. We see this, for example, in the famous reference to the understanding of rhythm within the aesthetic tradition determined by Western metaphysics that is offered with respect to the poetry of Trakl. Of the unsung poem that configures Trakl's poetry, he writes, I quote, and this is a few sentences that have been frequently repeated. I wish I had it on the screen for you. I'll read it twice. I quote, "From the site of the poem flows the wave that always moves, saying that is poetic. But the wave abandons the site of the poem so little that its flowing forth rather allows the moving of the saying to flow back into the always veiled origin. The site of the poem shelters as the source of the moving wave, the veiled essence of what will first appear to metaphysical aesthetic representation as rhythm." Again, almost in any text where you read about Heidegger on poetry and rhythm, you'll read these lines. And I'll just say it again. "From the site of the poem flows the wave that always moves, saying that is poetic. But the wave abandons the site of the poem so little that its flowing forth rather allows the moving of the saying to flow back into the always veiled origin. The site of the poem shelters as the source of the moving wave the veiled essence of what will first appear to metaphysical aesthetic representation as rhythm." So what he's describing in poetry then, as I'm going to be moving in this direction now, is a movement, a constant movement back. And what he's trying to think in poetry is the way in which this movement back is articulated. And that movement back, as he will tell us, is nothing other than the emergence of language as poietic. That's the generation of language, and with it, time and space. As I will try to show shortly, such an understanding of the origin, or Sprung, is at work throughout Heidegger's attempts to read Heidegger's river poems and his powerful interpretation of what a river is for Friedrich Hölderlin. Heidegger will not hesitate to describe both time and language as a river, even as he maintains the reference to a rhythmic determination of these forms of streaming. But I have moved ahead of myself a little by turning to the rhythmic configuration of art, so allow me to complete what I have presented thus far in a summary form and thereby attempt to prepare a little the fascinating step Heidegger makes when he turns from a productive notion of human usage to one that involves what he calls the use of the human in the rhythmic event that is art. And there I touch upon an important motif for me. That I read the so-called turn in Heidegger's thinking as involving in an important way a movement from a thought of production into this thought of usage. And in a thought of production, we have a subject projecting or producing for itself a world and producing itself. As we move into the 30s, we have a thought of an event whereby a subject comes to its being or to itself, and in what he calls a use of the human. And this is where things get particularly complicated for the question of humanism, and Heidegger, in my view, is now thinking in an anti-humanistic way, or a post-humanistic way, if you will. And things get, I think, quite interesting for questions of ecology and also temporality with respect to his thought of the divine. Okay, in the period of the existential analytic, essentially the later 20s, Heidegger thinks the human Dasein as a being that produces its world from the ground of an exposure. The structure is one of a finite transcendence. The self opens to the there of its being, traced as we have seen in the schematizing of its temporal horizons, and thereby gains relation to itself and to the beings it encounters in its world. More precisely, it gains a possible relation to a world into which it has been thrown, and whose meaning it must project in the interpretive movement of understanding and discursive articulation. The human Dasein must produce its world for itself, and as it projects upon its possibilities in its futural engagements, it effectively brings into play that reaching and contracting of temporal horizons that we have considered, which are the finite a priori of its praxis. The Dasein always moves from the Schwung of temporalization, constantly re-engaging, thus actively repeating the primordial movement of time itself, thereby bringing into play, once again, in repetition, a more fundamental rhythm. The temporal grounds of the Dasein, as we have seen, are shared and they are public. Thus, in all of its creative practices and practical comportments, some rhythmic measure must be commonly available. In short, from the temporal expressions and gestures of other drivers, I'm concluding with regard to my first example, from the temporal expressions of other expressions and gestures of other drivers, and believe me, they're very expressive in New York, it should be possible to catch the rhythms of a traffic circle and answer the injunction of the song I heard. I want you to get together. In the time of the existential analytic, once again, Heidegger thinks praxis and poiesis as forms of production. I repeat this basic point. He will say that the Dasein produces its world for itself and then engages that world at different levels of intensity or authenticity in its forms of practice. Art was always recognized in this period as essential to the disclosive activity of the Dasein. But art, too, was part of the Dasein's world-building or world-forming production. In the early 30s, however, when Heidegger turned to art in the time of his famous turn, he subjected this notion of production to a fundamental displacement. A phrase from Hölderlin marked this displacement for him poignantly. Full of merits, yet poetically man dwells. The achievements of humankind are essentially admirable, Hölderlin wants to tell us, but the essence of the human is realized and preserved in a form of work that obliges us to think of its creator not as producer, but as engaged witness in a relational ecology that does not exclude the question of the divine from its fourfold configuration. With his notion of the event, Heidegger begins to think the notion of shared usage from a use of the human with the implication that any creative act must be understood as a responsive one and cannot be thought with reference to a notion of cultural production. So we start getting some very serious attacks on the notion of culture in the early 30s as Heidegger turns away from, especially the National Socialist themes with regard to culture. Dwelling, this becomes a key word for him in this time of reading Hölderlin, 1934, right after the so-called, the rectoral episode. Dwelling is a rather innocent word for what Heidegger had in mind in 1934, which is, as I say, no more than a year after his rectoral experience, and for what he would describe still in 1944 in thinking the term with respect to his notion of ethos. The term witness itself, which I have just used, can be equally misleading if one fails to hear in it or hear it in relation to Heidegger's reflections on the tragic, particularly as they are informed by Hölderlin, because witness must also be martyr. The task for the artist, the poet first of all, though surely the musician would be in close company, remains one of engaging the temporalization of the human Dasein, now conceived as that of a folk, in such a way as to define a destinal ethos for this folk, this people. And ethos, in fact, will become a synonym for dwelling in 1944. It is to achieve for their the task is to achieve for the people's destiny a defining shape or gestalt. In other words, to bring their history, their temporality, into form. In the terms I've been using thus far, we could say that the poet's task is one of setting for a people the rhythms of their existence. Hölderlin was cited as saying, I quote, "all is rhythm." It would be the poet's task, in Heidegger's understanding, to give this phrase its proper ethical construction, by which I mean both articulation and realization, because it is the poet's task to bring that rhythm into form. But I want to emphasize that this would entail achieving a defining configuration of an ethos, a defining configuration, not just a monumental representation that could serve as a kind of model or exemplar. Here, the gestalt must in itself be formative. And I suppose it's the casting of the form of time, if you will. It must engage the mode of dwelling even as it indicates it, impelling those who experience it to a form of ethical transformation. So the question becomes then, what would the rhythmic structure of an artwork have to be to meet this exigency? My aim, I'm not watching time. I hope this is not going too long. Let me continue a bit. Are we okay? I carry on. My aim in this second half of my paper is to show you how Heidegger answered this question from the basis of his reading of Hölderlin's two great river poems, Germania and Der Rhein, in his lectures of 1934 and 35. There are other potential sites for addressing this question in Heidegger's work, but this site is of particular interest because Heidegger does not avoid confronting Hölderlin's reflections on the two tragedies by Sophocles that Hölderlin translated, reflections which contain some of the most far-reaching statements on rhythm that I have found, rhythm and time. I believe that if we push these reflections a little bit further than does Heidegger in the context of his interpretations of the rhythm of the river poems, we can open Heidegger's fascinating engagement with poetic rhythm to a thinking that is perhaps a bit more commensurate with our modern destiny than the one that Heidegger projected for the West in his dream of a proper national socialism. The lectures of 34 and 35 on Hölderlin are far more complicated than they might first appear, so my remarks on them must remain sketchy and limited in focus. The lectures unfold through the course of readings of two poems, two of Hölderlin's great river hymns, Germania and Der Rhein. They are treated successively, but the argument proceeds by a kind of repetition whereby an initial account of the poet's experience of time, which defines his poetic Stimmung, or his attunement, his aesthetic condition, if you will, is then developed more fundamentally with an account of the poet's relation to the origin of his poetizing, his Dichtung. So Heidegger thus begins with an account of the distinctive poetic sensibility from which Hölderlin writes, implicitly recasting the Schillerian or broadly romantic understanding of the poetic condition, aesthetic condition, in Hölderlin's terms, while obliging us to think the structure of poetic Grundstimmung from the poet's relation to language. I'm going very fast here, but what he does is he takes initially Hölderlin in relation to a Schillerian account of the aesthetic condition and then rethinks that in terms of temporality and Hölderlin's idea of a tonality which is what Hölderlin calls holy morning. And Heidegger identifies this holy morning as a Grundstimmung, defining the poet's relation to language. It is in this account of the temporal structure of poetic Stimmung, attunement, which makes explicit reference to the existential analytic, Heidegger points right back to the 20s, that we are first given a hint of the thought of rhythm that informs his lecture series. Heidegger then moves in the second part of his lectures, once he's developed this idea of what are called an aesthetic condition, to the poem The Rhine, Der Rhein, and shows us how the poetic act brings to articulation the poet's relation to what Heidegger terms his metaphysical site, which is nothing other than the fatherland, but conceived here from the grounds of a relation to gods and earth, a relation in itself already inherently conflictual. This poetic or poietic act involves disclosing to a people both the grounds of its need for poetry and the essence of poetry itself, even as it offers a possible configuration of a destinal ethos. What we have in this section of the lecture series, in short, is a Heideggerian step back from aesthetic disposition to poetic event, a movement of reflection that offers a glimpse as it unfolds of what Heidegger, by his own admission, could not quite bring to an adequate account in his monumental essay, The Origin of the Work of Art. This wanting dimension of the artwork essay involves the relation of being and human being, which is ultimately the proper conceptual context for the question I broached at the outset of my paper, which is the relation of rhythm, since my question ultimately involves both the formal structure of the poetic act and the experience of the event that occurs there. I am interested, in other words, in the human experience of rhythm, and therefore what we might call the human share in that event. Again, time will not permit me to follow the movement of the lectures, nor, I imagine, will your patience, even though some of the material is really very astonishing and often playful. And I so wish I could read you a little passage on centaurs, which is present there, where he tells us centaurs are the proper natural scientists. Because they think to turn in rivers, and this is his topic, how rivers turn back upon themselves. And centaurs understand this better than anyone. So what I propose to do is pause for a moment over an introductory statement by Heidegger touching on the rhythmic structure of a poem, which Heidegger calls the poem's Schwingungsgefüge. You remember that word Schwingung. It's Gefüge, it's structure of a swaying or movement, which he takes up before moving into his interpretation of the structure of the poetic act that is composed in and as the poem Der Rhein. Whether this Schwingungsgefüge, as he describes it, of the destinal Gestalt or form offered to us by the poem actually characterizes the poem itself is a question I won't address. This is a really big problem, I suppose, in terms of a critique of Heidegger's Poetics. Is this account of poetry answered properly by his interpretation of Hölderlin? And that's a big question. But what I would like to look rather to the way Heidegger understands the rhythmic Gestalt that is offered thematically by the work in relation to what Hölderlin says in his remarks about the rhythmic structure of tragedy. So I'm going to look at this formally, and I'm going to look at it in relation to what Heidegger takes from Hölderlin on rhythm. Because from this perspective, the Heideggerian interpretation suffers a profound disruption that opens a number of, I think, quite vital questions for us. The introductory statement about Schwingungsgefüge, to which I referred, comes at the start of the first chapter and in a first approach to the question of poetic language, a topic to which Heidegger will devote long pages in the first part of his lectures, trying to challenge our normal grasp of the representational character of poetry. Again, for Heidegger, poetry doesn't represent. The Gestalt that is brought to form in the poem is actually defining for the poet and for those who are attempting its reading or in the engagement with the poetry. So it's not a representation, it's something which we have to engage in such a way that we are transformed with it. He starts with a brief interpretive gesture that points to the importance of attending to poetic syntax, but then moves on to a more general statement suggesting that we are in fact not reading Hölderlin if we seek an expressed meaning in syntactical constructions or even in what he calls the overarching resonance of the poet's saying. Indeed, it will never be a matter of expressed meaning and the form of representation it presupposes. And as far as word choice or positioning are concerned, he tells us they must be grasped from what he has called the overarching resonance. And this is the Schwingungsgefüge. Heidegger then goes on to tell us the following about the determining elements of poetic composition. The overarching resonance of the telling is the initial creative resonance that first intimates the language. It is the origin. So the poet's experience of the overarching resonance of the telling is the origin, not only for the arranging and positioning of words, but also for the choice of words, an origin whose resonance constantly anticipates the use of words. This overarching resonance of the telling, however, is from the outset determined by the fundamental attunement of the poetry, which takes form within the inner outline of the whole. There's the Aufriss, taking form within the inner outline of the whole, which is a whole of the poet's experience. The fundamental attunement, for its part, grows out of the particular metaphysical locale of the poetry in question. It is a dense, extraordinary passage that calls for extensive commentary, but you will recognize immediately its pertinence for the question of rhythm in Heidegger's reference to this Schwingungsgefüge, this structure of sway and resonance. It will be apparent, too, that Heidegger is moving back in his characteristic fashion through the predetermining conditions of poetic composition. He thus identifies three apparently pre-linguistic dimensions of the poetic process, though his subsequent analyses will make it clear that all three of these dimensions of the poetic act belong to the unfolding of language that Heidegger will name Dichtung. So we have first this Schwingungsgefüge, which is pre-linguistic in the sense that he says it intimates language. This is the big theme of Ahnung, sensing language, something that allows for a relation to language. It is determining for word choice, and Heidegger speaks of it as an origin. It's determining and points to word choice in an anticipative manner. It orients or directs toward, opening onto and indicating. It shows this way, Heidegger will tell us, in its originating, orienting impetus. Of course, this dimension of the poetic process has to be inferred from the composed text as what has defined that composition through the stamping of its articulating force. And it is strictly impossible to separate what syntactical and lexical discoveries have produced in composition from what lent to those discoveries in intimation. Heidegger knows and recognizes this elemental formalist notion. In other words, that you can't divorce this orienting impulse from what is actually fashioned in and through the syntactical and lexical operations. They can't be divorced. But he keeps this notion of an a priori. In other words, he continues to speak of an originating anticipation because I think he wants to insist on the grounding of the structure of resonance in the poetic Stimmung, which has, he tells us, an earthly determination. This is why I was speaking of ecology. Heidegger will give considerable import in his interpretation to Hölderlin's statement that the poet suffers with the waters of the land. The rivers, which, as Hölderlin writes, are to language in their need for a sign. The poet thus participates in the anticipation and intimation of physis itself in its earthly dimension, though this is already the taking of an inner outline, what Heidegger named the Aufriss in the passage that I read a few moments ago. In short, we are effectively on the cusp of language here, precisely at that point where physis is turning in and to language. That's the river's turn, the point where physis is turning into language. That's where the poet is situated and taking this outline of this turn in his or her fundamental Stimmung. In the origin of the work of art, Aufriss, this outline, is given a very prominent place as the name of the opening design for the artwork's differential structure. And in later essays, it will be taken as the name for the essence of language itself, in precisely its differential function. In the forming of the Grundstimmung, therefore, the Aufriss is taken in its schematic outline. You'll hear that I'm linking this to the earlier statements on temporality. And I think that what we have is this, he's taking the notion of schematism, which he drew from Kant, and which he described as a product of the transcendental imagination, into a thought of the poetic work of poetic language, which is a tracing of the temporal conditions of space and time for a people. And what he's trying to do is think how this works in the poem. Heidegger then moves to the most fundamental determining level for the Schwingungsgefüge of the poem by defining the origin of the poetic Grundstimmung, the fundamental tonality, as we heard, as the metaphysical site of the poetry. In a strictly logical sense, this conditioning site is prior to the initial formation of Dichtung in the inner outline of poetic attunement. It is thus prior to language, though again it is originary in its manner of inciting to language. The gods' relation to humans, Heidegger tells us, and following Herlenin, involves an invitation or a beckoning that stirs to dialogue. The god hints, and the poet must bring these divine signs to language. So what Heidegger is describing for us in this paragraph on the Schwingungsgefüge, which I've been reading, and its determining conditions, is in fact the origin of Dichtung, which is determinative for a people's language, and which, at even its most profound level, in its genesis, is already inviting and anticipating what the poet will bring to that language. This does not mean that poetic attunement is always already language, or rather it does mean just that, but it also tells us that language needs something of the human, which is brought in the poet's attunement. I'm touching here on the use of the human for the advent of language, which will become a major motif in the reading of the Rhine, and a major motif in Heidegger's subsequent later thinking. Let me add one point regarding the paragraph we have just read on the rhythmic structure of poetry before moving to Heidegger's interpretation of his second river poem. I have alluded to the fact that Heidegger forces things in his effort to draw back from the syntactical and lexical features of the poem, because his aim is to bring us to read those features from the rhythmic structure that defines their composition and ultimately grounds their meaning. If I may indulge in his own rhetoric, I would say that his effort is to draw back in this manner as one might draw a bow, bringing a form and resonance to every linguistic feature by inscribing it in a differential play whose acutely conflictual character, tensional character, Heidegger describes as Heraclitian. And this is where the bow comes from. There is in fact a quite violent conflict at the heart of the rhythmic structure Heidegger seeks to define. The term reißen, tear, pull, which gives us Aufriss, this outline, already points to this fact, and the reading of the Rhine, to which I turn in just a moment, gives evidence of it. For the topic I want to address here, the question of the nature of this violence becomes crucial. Can it be sublated in some form of resolution? Heidegger's own meditation on this motif would suggest that it cannot. And so Heidegger's effort to draw this into a finished Gestalt, a form that would give a kind of totalizing form for a people, becomes highly problematic. Let me turn then to this reading of the Rhine to consider how Heidegger constructs the poem's rhythmic structure. The construction is in fact quite formally precise, as we see from a schema with 4 terms that he offers in the course of his presentation. But the play of forces he evokes with this schema is in fact defining for a turning movement upon which Herlenin focuses in his effort to describe the course of the river as it wells up from its origins and rushes down toward the east before turning back again into the German homeland. What Heidegger wants to capture in this analysis is the nature of the turn and its Gestalt, which he wants to take as defining for the German destiny. So there are 4 elements in the forces that are at work in this turning of the Rhine, which is actually topologically verifiable. But what I'm interested in is the topology of this turn, ultimately, the way in which this turning is defining precisely the emergence of language as a poetic act that is also the condition of space and time and anything like a subject's relation to them. So there are four terms. There's the divine. He calls this illuminating ray. There's the divine. There's the earth. These are somewhat coded sexually. It's mother and father. And then he has 2 terms, need and discipline. Discipline comes from the father. Need is much more enigmatic and comes from the mother. The river then is described by Hölderlin as a half-god with who is the issue of a violent coupling between divine and earthly powers, mother and father. Called to attend this birth and to suffer it with the river, the poet too is a half-god, something more than human, Heidegger means. Required to stand in the midst of the conflict between gods and earth, which is to say also between gods and mortals, whom Heidegger describes as closer to the abyss borne by the earth, which is exposed in the conflict. I'm going so fast. The mortals, the fact that the poet is called to this site of conflict is important because Hölderlin will insist mortals are closer to the earth than our gods. And it is in that proximity to the earth that humans are needed for something like the advent of being. The poet is called to suffer with the river and brings witness to its struggle in attaining its accomplished form. That suffering is in fact extreme by reason of the impetuous will of the river spirit. The half-gods are blindest, Hölderlin says, and Heidegger will not hesitate to make the identification on this ground with Oedipus, as he is described by Hölderlin. The identification is important because it signals that Heidegger is reading Hölderlin's description of the river's course from the basis of Hölderlin's account of the rhythmic structure of tragedy. I'll come back to that very briefly. It's crucial, but also, again, immense. The river issues from a coupling of gods and earth, then, surging impetuously only to find its course broken. Again, by topographical necessity, the river must turn. It wants to go east, it has to turn back. And in doing so, Hölderlin claims, it turns back upon its origin, sort of twists back almost in fury, assuming the necessity of this turn back, both through need and the constraint of a discipline that derive ultimately from the powers of the origin themselves. The god and the earth prove to be very severe parents. I almost regret having to review the terms of this structure because they sound far more ridiculous in summary than they do in the detail of Heidegger's exposition. Though I have to acknowledge that Heidegger's willingness to indulge in a mythic construction is already somewhat difficult to bear and problematic. But I hope to evoke in this way the topology at work here because Heidegger is inscribing within the fourfold structure of the originary determinations of the river's being a turning and a twisting that conform to the description I read to you earlier regarding a welling movement, a surging movement in the poem. This is the basis of the poem's rhythm. Rhythm, as Heidegger insists once again, articulates, and what it articulates is a streaming that takes form not in some simple course, however curvilinear, but in a constant turning back, a folding back, a fold. The rhythm that forms in the river's course has its source in that turning. This topology is difficult enough to conceive if we recall that Heidegger understands it as the founding configuration of a people's destiny, the gestalt of its historical destiny in an earthly site that becomes such a site by virtue of the poetic act that brings it to language. And it is all the more difficult to grasp, I think, but also intriguing if we recall that Heidegger identifies the poet and river as, Hölderlin identifies the poet and river as half-gods that suffer this relation to the origin and thereby recognize that the topology I've sought to evoke defines the poet's experience as it is brought to form in the work. That experience, in turn, cannot be thought apart from its inner outline, which gives form to it, and thus the topology also describes the origination of language for a people in its time, an origination that actually sets the very conditions of space and time for that people. The river's turning as it is brought to language in the poem, in fact, describes, in the sense of a drawing out, the genesis and unfolding of Dichtung. The river is a river, Heidegger insists, but as brought to language in the founding act of the poem, and thereby initially brought to its being as a river, it is also the advent of language itself, thought from its source. Its course in Dichtung, as Dichtung, describes the topology of the saying of being. Now, I'm very worried about the time that I've taken thus far, and also late in the day where there have been a lot of challenging ideas to assimilate in many forms of language. So I think that what I'm going to do is pull up a little bit short here, though I want to develop very quickly, or just sketch for you very quickly, something to which I've been alluding, which is that when Heidegger takes the the river poems to develop this notion of a rhythmic structure that would be at the ground of poiesis, and thereby at the ground of any saying of being, and therefore, as I said, the conditions of space and time for our people. He's reading, at the same time, Holonin's extraordinary introductory remarks to his translations of Sophocles. These are the remarks on Antigone and the remarks on Oedipus. And in both of these texts, and these introductory remarks to the translations, Holonin develops a notion of history and temporality that is, again, based upon a rhythmic structure, although he describes it as counter-rhythmic. In other words, he reads the movements of the two plays by Sophocles, Antigone and Oedipus, as structured by what he describes as a counter-rhythmic turn, or a caesura. And you will have heard this, I'm sure, in some references to Holonin. And in and by this caesura, there is a definition of time for that poetic act, which means for the people of that poetic act. And what Holonin appears to be trying to do in this analysis of the, let's say, the rhythmic structure of the work, is to try to rethink the conditions of representation in the respective times of the Greeks and the Germans. In other words, he's trying to think the forms of representation for his time. And he thinks that by analyzing these rhythmic structures and then understanding how the time works itself in the relation of the Greeks and the Germans, he can then begin to approach the question of representation for modernity. And when he evokes that question of representation for modernity, he gives us an understanding of time as irreversible and rather punishing, frankly. But it is a structure of time that doesn't fit what Heidegger is trying to describe in those river poems. So we have, we have in a certain sense the possibility of a deconstruction of what Heidegger is proposing in these extraordinary readings of the river poems, simply by following Holonin's own thinking, which Heidegger is reading to interpret them. And what we get thereby is, as I say, still a fundamental a fundamental thought of time, but it's a disrupted time, which produces, it's a disrupted time produced by a kind of arrhythmic interruption. And Holonin would want us to think, I think, the modernity of our forms of representation from this temporality. That sounded a lot more complex in reading it this time, and it was more complex reading it than it was when I was reading it to myself a little while ago. And it has been a while since I have read it, so I apologize for a slightly a lack of rhythm at certain moments, but I hope the general lines of this can be were perhaps comprehensible. Should I take a couple questions now? Oh.